Greetings to you, dear viewers. Today is November 30th, 2025, and we are presenting our traditional analysis of the frontline situation. Today's episode will differ from the usual format. We will not be examining daily positional adjustments. Instead, as we had planned together, we will conduct a comprehensive monthly review covering the period from November 1st through November 29th, essentially the entire past month. The most significant transformations of the theatre of military operations occurred in the Huliaipol and Dnipropetrovsk sectors. Substantial changes have also been recorded in the Pokrovsk direction. The Krasnolymansk and Siversk sectors have also undergone serious modifications. In the remaining segments of the front, there is movement, but it is less pronounced compared to the aforementioned zones. I want to remind my subscribers about the opportunity to support our project. You can mark this video with a positive rating and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. Your comments are especially important to me. I ask those who watch the material to completion to definitely share your opinion. I carefully study every response. Write what aspects should be changed in future episodes. Would you be interested in receiving a similar monthly analysis at the end of December? We proceed directly to the cartographic material. We begin our review with the Zaporizhzhia sector, since the Kherson direction has remained stable over the past 30 days. Without any territorial changes, information reports come predominantly from there. We move to the Orakov sector. In the Orakov direction, adjustments are noted in the zone of the settlement of Novodanilovka. As you know, activity was also observed in the area of Mala Tokmachka, and events occurred in the vicinity of the village of Plavny. In the first decade of the month, Russian units carried out an offensive in the Plavny area. The territory that I marked with a red marker completely passed under the control of Russian forces. It is noteworthy that these territorial acquisitions were recorded in the initial period of the month, and subsequently no information about further changes came from this sector. In parallel, intense clashes continue for control over Stepnohorsk. I remind you that operational summaries arrive daily from this zone. However, throughout the entire month, the line of contact here remained unchanged. No advancement has been recorded, either in favor of Russian formations or in favor of Ukrainian troops. Regarding the operations of Russian units in the Mala Tokmachka area, let me remind you of the chronology of events. Russian servicemen penetrated the central quarters of Mala Tokmachka, organized defensive positions there, after which they methodically expanded the controlled territory throughout the month and eventually established full control over this settlement. The latest reliable materials came from this very section of combat operations. The entire zone highlighted in red is under the full control of Russian forces. Nevertheless, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation officially announced that Mala Tokmachka is completely controlled by the armed forces of the RF. At the moment, we do not have documentary confirmation of further expansion of the control zone. Also, over the past month, changes occurred in the area of the village of Novodanilovka. In this locality, Russian formations conducted a storm operation and established themselves in the central part of this settlement. I will deliberately not indicate the exact parameters of the advancement of Russian or Ukrainian military according to cartographic data. For this reason, this review will be presented without detailed metric indicators. At the current moment, all the territory marked with a red marker passed under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation over the elapsed month. However, it should be noted that the penetration of Russian troops into Novodanilovka occurred only a few days ago. We move to the Huliaipol direction. In the Huliaipol sector, significant transformations have been recorded over the past month. Those who regularly view our daily materials know that previously Russian units were storming the settlement of Uspenivka. This was one of the most fortified strongpoints of Ukrainian forces, after the capture of which the entire VSU defense line in this sector began to crumble. In the initial phase of the month, Russian troops carried out storm operations against Uspenivka, Novovasilivska, as well as the village of Ribna, simultaneously advancing in the direction of the settlements of Nova and Solodka. After capturing this key fortified area of the VSU, namely Uspenivka, Russian formations advanced significantly in this segment of the front. Over the past 30 days, all this territory highlighted in red completely passed under the control of Russian forces. The chronological sequence of events is as follows. Russian units initially captured the settlements of Krasnohorska and Rybna, then took control of Novovasilivska and Novomykolaivka, and only after that seized Uspenivka. After the fall of Uspenivka, expansion of the controlled zone began in the direction of the villages of Solodka and Nova. Further Russian troops advanced toward the next settlements, Rivnopilia, Yablukovo and Novo-Uspenivska. Then the villages of Vesela came under control, and literally in recent days, Russian formations cleared the settlements of Zeleny High, Vysoke and Zaporizhzhia. Currently, strikes are being delivered against VSU positions directly in Huliaipol. Reports have repeatedly arrived that Russian military are already present in this settlement. There are diversionary reconnaissance groups in this village. Strikes are also being conducted against Ukrainian positions in the area of the settlements of Doorbilia, Prilukki, Pavlivka and Zelensky. Some pro-Russian information channels claimed that Russian troops substantially expanded the controlled territory in the Doorbilia area. It is quite possible that at the time of creating today's video material, this settlement is already under Russian control, considering that Russian forces are exerting pressure from the direction of Nove Zaporizhzhia. Over the current month in this sector, precisely such changes occurred. All the territory marked with a red marker passed under the control of Russian forces. We move to the Dnipropetrovsk sector. In the Dnipropetrovsk direction, significant transformations are observed. Serious changes have been recorded in the Novopavlivka sector, which is part of the Dnipropetrovsk direction. We begin the analysis with the settlements of Yehorivka, Danilivka, Otradna and Novolexandrivka. Regarding the advancement of Russian formations, the following should be noted. As you know, in the initial phase of the month, Russian troops controlled all this territory. The line of contact of forces passed precisely in this manner, and the village of Vishnyovo only at the beginning of the month came under Russian control. On the 29th to 30th of October, this settlement passed under the control of the armed forces of the RF. It is marked in grey. However, at the beginning of November, this village was under the control of the armed forces of the RF. After this, Russian units naturally captured the settlement of Yehorivka. Pressure began in the direction of the village of Danilivka. However, in this zone for a long time, no advancement was recorded. No confirming materials arrived, after which Russian troops, of course, took Danilivka, advanced in the direction of the settlement of Nechayevka, captured Radostne, seized Nove Zaporizhzhia, and are moving in the direction of Huliaipol. Also at present, active pressure is being exerted on the settlements of Ostapivska and Andreevka. However, in daily summaries and video reviews, we discuss this pressure on these villages. In addition, Russian troops at the beginning of the month captured the settlement of Oleksivka, attempted to reach the supply route that leads to Aristopol. It is precisely here that the supply road passes. In this zone, fierce clashes were conducted. Ukrainian servicemen attempted to conduct counterattacks in the direction of the village of Sosnivka. After which all counteroffensives were repelled, it was not possible to push back Russian forces, and Russian troops naturally reached this supply road, physically cut it. After which they already captured the settlement of Aristopol, and pressure continued in the direction of the village of Tika. At present, Tika is under Russian control. Aristopol is under the control of Russian forces. Also, Russian troops captured over the past month the settlement of High and Novolexandrivka. And pressure is ongoing. More precisely, pressure continues on the village of Oleksandrivka. Aviation strikes from the Russian army arrive in the area of the settlement of Malinivka, and strikes are being delivered against VSU positions in the area of the village of Velikomykhailivka. Also here I did not mark for you, but all this territory up to the Vulture River has also been completely cleared in recent days and passed under Russian control. Also reports arrived that Russian troops have already forded the Vulture River and established themselves in the settlement of Velikomykhailivka. However, confirming information has not yet arrived. As of today in this direction, over the past month, such changes occurred. All territory marked with a red marker passed under the full control of Russian forces. We move to the Novopavlivka area. In the Novopavlivka area, Russian troops, as you know, took advantage of weather conditions. They penetrated this settlement. First, they entered the southern part, then entered from the direction of the settlement of Kostiantynivka. It is precisely here that Kostiantynivka is located, and Russian troops established themselves in this settlement on the northeastern outskirts. They proceeded further to the supply road that leads from the direction of the village of Medjeva. Medjeva is located in this place, and Russian troops physically cut the supply road to the settlement of Pavlivka, and already over the past few days, this settlement passed under full Russian control. It has been completely cleared and is controlled by Russian servicemen. I remind you that previously, Russian troops for a long time could not advance in the direction of Pavlivka, since here fortified areas of the VSU were located along the supply route between Pavlivka and Dakhne. Here fierce combat operations were conducted north of the settlement of Dakhne. For a long time, Russian aviation worked against VSU positions, against fortified areas that are located along this road. After which, naturally, taking advantage of weather conditions, Russian troops successfully penetrated Pavlivka. Repeatedly, news arrived from there that Russian diversionary reconnaissance groups were operating here, however no groups were recorded. More precisely, there was no confirming information, but such news arrived. And now we already observe that Pavlivka has completely passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. Also completely cleared is the pocket between the settlement of Filia and Orikhiv. Here for a long time they could not clear the pocket, now it has been completely cleared. At the current moment, Russian troops are clearing territory, straightening the front line between the settlement of Pavlivka and Muravka along the Solona River. It is precisely here that the Solona River flows, and all this territory in the coming days, possibly, will pass under Russian control. Also, it is reported that Russian troops captured Ivanivka. However, Ivanivka at the beginning of the month was already under the control of Russian military. Over the past few days from there arrived additional confirming materials about the confident control of Russian servicemen over this settlement. Over the past month we have such changes in this direction. We move to the Pokrovsk direction. In the Pokrovsk direction, serious changes are observed, large-scale transformations. I would say, let's turn off the current map and set the map for November 1st. On November 1st, this section of combat operations looked as follows. Let's proceed to the settlement of Dakhne. In this zone, Russian troops were expanding the controlled territory north of this settlement. Reports came of fierce clashes in the factory area. It is precisely here that intense combat operations were conducted. Ukrainian servicemen attacked Russian positions, delivered strikes against positions of Russian forces in the area of the settlement of Dakhne. At the current moment, this territory passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. Also, over the past few days, Russian troops managed to expand the control zone north and northeast of the settlement of Kotlino. It is precisely here that Kotlino is located, and Russian troops over the past few days captured all this territory under full control. It passed under the control of Russian forces, completely cleared and completely demined. In addition, as you know, it was reported that a large strongpoint of the VSU was captured here. As for Pokrovsk itself, previously the map looked precisely this way. On November 1st, the map had this appearance. Clearing of the central part was taking place. Also clearing was taking place of the Shakhtarsky, Lazurny and Solnechny micro-districts. They were still controlled by Ukrainian servicemen. At the beginning of the month, reports arrived that Russian troops had actually cleared Lazurny and moved in the direction of the Shakhtarsky and Solnechny micro-districts. Clearing operations of these areas were conducted. Storm operations of the central part were carried out. News arrived that Russian troops were expanding the control zone along the railway line, which passes precisely in this manner. As of today, the map looks as follows. All territory marked with a red marker over the past month passed under the full control of Russian forces. Russian troops advanced in the direction of the settlement of Hryshine. As you know, yesterday Russian troops managed to establish themselves in the settlement of Hryshine. Here Russian troops established themselves in the southeastern part of Hryshine and also expanded the control zone, and now possibly already at the time of recording the video material, they have expanded the control zone much further toward the center of this settlement. Also, Russian troops cleared all territory in the area of Schmidt Street. For a long time, clearing operations went on here. The map looked precisely this way. All territory that I will mark for you in red it was under the control of the VSU, was not controlled by Russian military, and over the past few days, all this territory has been completely cleared. Also, Russian troops advanced in the northern and northeastern part of Pokrovsk. As of today, all territory marked with a red marker passed under the full control of Russian forces. At present, storm operations are being conducted of the settlement of Rivne. Information arrived that Russian assault troops are present in this settlement. However, confirming information never arrived. All information arrives in the form of news, and in the form of news we do not make changes to the map. As for Myrnohrad, in the Myrnohrad area, serious changes are also observed over the past month. Let's start with the southern part. Literally a few days ago, all territory in the area of Suky Yar, as well as in the area of the settlement of Lisivka, passed under the full control of Russian forces. Previously, news arrived that here Russian troops were expanding the control zone north of the settlement of Lisivka. Fierce combat operations were conducted in the area of the settlement of Suky Yar. And finally, confirming materials arrived about the transition of all this territory under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. Also, the last point, the forward position was located precisely in this forest belt. Here, forward positions of the armed forces of the RF were located, and thus we observe that Russian troops are gradually clearing the pocket between Pokrovsk and the southern part of Myrnohrad. All this territory is gradually passing under the control of the armed forces of the RF. Also, Russian troops expanded the control zone of the eastern part, the southern part of Myrnohrad. Here, forward positions of Russian forces were located precisely at this point. The entire southern part is now cut off from supply. If VSU units are present on this territory, then they are completely cut off from supply, and at the current moment, possibly within 1 to 2 weeks, all this territory may pass under the control of the armed forces of the RF, since supply for the VSU and in Myrnohrad itself is completely cut off. All supply roads are taken under physical control, and the ring has physically closed. Regarding the advancement of Russian troops in Myrnohrad itself, Russian troops first advanced in the Molodizhny micro-district. Attempts were repeatedly made to establish themselves in this micro-district. This section of combat operations at the beginning of the month passed under the control of Russian forces. Russian troops advanced along this forest belt, established themselves on the eastern outskirts of the Molodizhny micro-district. Aviation bombs repeatedly hit the central part of Molodizhny, after which Russian troops expanded the control zone in this micro-district, cleared all this territory, and at the current moment the Molodizhny, Svitly and Skidny micro-districts are under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. All territory marked, with a red marker over the past month, completely passed under the control of Russian forces. Also, Russian troops expanded the control zone slightly north of Myrnohrad, in the area of Krasnolymansk. Krasnolymansk passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. Repeatedly here, there were changes in the coloring of the map in favor of the Russian army. All this territory, I will mark it for you, previously passed under the control of Russian forces, then again passed under Ukrainian control, and now the map looks as follows. Russian troops advanced significantly to the crossroads, precisely this crossroads, the crossroads of death. Here is a huge amount of destroyed VSU equipment, armored vehicles that moved with supplies in the direction of the settlement of both Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. From the direction of the settlements of Hryshyn, from the direction of the settlement of Doorbilia, and here all equipment at this crossroads was destroyed. This video material I showed you yesterday in the review. Over the past month, Russian troops advanced across all this territory, and all territory marked with a red marker is under the confident control of the armed forces of the RF. As of today, such changes are here. We move to the Doorbilia salient. As you know, quite a lot of contradictory information comes from the Doorbilia salient. There are changes in the area of the settlement of Rodinsky. Repeatedly here, territory passed either under the control of Russian forces or under the control of the VSU. At the current moment, this section of combat operations, marked for you with a red marker, over the past month passed under the control of the armed forces of the RF. Also, the entire Doorbilia salient has been completely cut off. Previously, Russian troops were in the settlement of Zoloty Kolodets, Rubizhna, Kucherevya. They also reached the settlement of Petrovka. Russian servicemen were present in the settlement of Vilna, Novashakova, Ivanivka and Dorozhnya. Over the past month, this entire Doorbilia salient has been completely cut off. Russian troops were forced to roll back, and all territory marked in yellow passed under VSU control over the past 30 days. As for the settlement of Shakova and Volodymyrivka, here quite a lot of disputed information arrived, both from pro-Russian and from pro-Ukrainian sources. However, nevertheless, the map as of today looks as follows. All changes are made after receiving confirming information. Also, there is coloring in favor of the Russian army. In these sections of combat operations, they passed under the control of Russian forces. I remind you that at present, the settlement of Zaporizhzhia, more precisely Suvorova, is under the control of the armed forces of the RF. However, it is not yet colored in favor of the Russian army, since there is no confirming information. Information arrives in the form of news. Here quite a lot, I remind you, of disputed information arrives from both sides. For this reason, the map here changes not as often as in other sections of combat operations. As of today, such changes are here. We move further along the map. In the Kostiantynivka direction, there are changes. Changes concern both the settlement of Ivanopilia, also Klebanbyk, Predtekina, and the direction in the area of the settlement of Stepanivka, Yablunivka. Let's start perhaps with the settlement of Rusin Yar. This section of combat operations over the past month passed under the control of Russian forces. More precisely, it possibly passed much earlier, however, nevertheless, confirming materials about the expansion of the control zone arrived this month. Also, Russian troops over the past few days advanced north of the settlement of Yablunivka and north of the settlement of Alexandra Kalinova. All this territory over the past few days passed under the control of the armed forces of the RF. As for monthly changes, over the month, all territory in the area of the settlement of Ivanopilia and Ivanopilia itself passed under the full control of Russian forces. Also, the settlement of Klebanbyk was cleared. For quite a long time, Klebanbyk was not under the control of Russian servicemen. From there, also much disputed information arrived, despite the fact that the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation stated that Klebanbyk was under the control of Russian forces. This information did not correspond to reality. No confirming materials arrived. Over the past month, all territory marked for you with a red marker in the area of Klebanbyk was completely cleared and passed under the control of Russian forces. Also, territory passed into the area of the settlement of Ivanopilia, and as of today reports arrive that active combat operations are being conducted in the area of Pleshchayevka. And possibly any day now, this settlement will also pass under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. Also, Russian troops expanded the control zone significantly in Kostiantynivka itself, the southeastern part. All this territory over the past month passed under the control of Russian forces. Also, at the beginning of this month, all territory marked in grey passed under the full control of Russian forces. Here, advancement amounted to up to 1 kilometer precisely in the first days of November. As for the settlement of Predtekine repeatedly passed from hand to hand. First, it was under the control of Ukrainian servicemen, after which Russian troops entered the southwestern outskirts of Predtekine, established themselves, supposedly took Predtekine under control, after which again Ukrainian military counterattacked, pushed back Russian forces. At the current moment, Predtekine is under the control of the armed forces of the RF. All territory marked with a red marker is completely under the control of Russian forces and completely cleared. As of today, such changes are here over the past month. We move to the Siversk direction. In the Siversk direction, serious changes are observed. They concern both Siversk itself and the settlement of Zvanivka. At the beginning of the month, Russian troops established themselves in the central part of the settlement of Zvanivka. It is precisely from these points that video materials arrived, where forward positions of Russian forces were located. Here, Russian troops precisely at the beginning of the month advanced 1.5 kilometers, and all this territory passed under the control of the armed forces of the RF in the first days. After which Russian troops naturally stormed the settlement of Zvanivka for a long time. There was even establishment of Russian servicemen in the southern part of Siversk itself. However, Zvanivka did not pass under the control of Russian forces. Literally a few days ago, this settlement passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. Also, Russian troops cleared the pocket between the settlement of Zvanivka and Vyimka, and all territory marked with a red marker over the past month passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. At the current moment, storm operations are being conducted of the settlement of Siversk. Russian troops are already present in the central part of this settlement. They also expanded the control zone north of this settlement. All territory marked with a red marker passed under the full control of Russian forces. At present, active clearing of fortified areas east of Siversk itself is also being conducted. Fortified areas are marked for you in yellow with yellow lines. It is precisely here that fortified areas run, and Russian troops entered these fortified areas both from the southern part and already from the northern part, and are gradually clearing these fortified areas. Possibly, in the coming week, all this territory, this entire pocket, will be cleared and will pass under the control of Russian forces. Also confirming materials arrived from the settlement of Platonivka. Previously, as you know, at the beginning of the month, Russian troops took under full control the settlement of Dronivka. Reports arrived over the course of probably 2 weeks that Russian troops entered and established themselves in the settlement of Platonivka. However, no confirming information came from there. Now there is confirming information about the full control of Russian forces over the settlement of Platonivka. All territory marked with a red marker over the past month, more precisely over this month, all territory marked in red passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. At the beginning of the month, the map looked as follows. Now you can observe that all territory marked with a red marker is under the full control of Russian forces, completely cleared, and pressure is already going on the settlement of Pokrovsk and on Siversk itself. Siversk has literally a few weeks left, since supply in the Platonivka area is completely cut off. Supply from the direction of the settlement of Pokrovsk, which goes through Reznikivka, is also cut off, is under fire control, and some sources of the VSU already report that the VSU are leaving Siversk and exiting through fields from this settlement. We continue to monitor the situation in this section of combat operations. Let's return to the Krasnolymansk direction. From the Krasnolymansk direction, also over the past month, a huge amount of changes arrives. Several settlements passed under the full control of Russian forces. Let's turn on the map for the beginning of the month. At the beginning of the month, the map looked as follows. Russian troops established themselves in the central part of the settlement of Yampil, after which, as you know, Ukrainian servicemen counterattacked positions of Russian forces and pushed back Russian forces in this settlement. After which storm operations of the settlement of Yampil were already conducted. Fierce combat operations were conducted north of this settlement. As of today, Yampil completely passed under the control of Russian forces. Russian troops reached the supply road, took it physically, cut it physically, and now are pressing in the direction of the settlement of Dnipropetrovsk. These changes arrived literally over the past week. Also, territory between the settlement of Yampil and Platonivka was cleared. This entire pocket is now under the full control of Russian forces. Also, Russian troops successfully advanced in the area of the settlement of Lyman. As you know, previously video materials arrived precisely from these points. Here, forward positions of Russian forces were located, after which Ukrainian servicemen counterattacked, pushed back Russian forces in this section of combat operations, and all this territory passed under the control of the VSU. Positions of the armed forces of the RF were on the eastern outskirts, which were subjected to attacks from the VSU. After which, Russian military conducted storm operations and established themselves much further in the settlement of Lyman. Video materials arrived from houses with red and blue roofs. It is precisely here that forward positions of Russian forces were. Also in these houses were forward positions of Russian forces, which were subjected to attacks and recounts by the VSU. As of today, all this territory passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF. Also reports arrived that here, Russian troops are significantly expanding the control zone in this settlement, however confirming materials never arrived. Also the settlement of Stavki passed under the full control of Russian forces. Here Russian troops repeatedly attempted to storm this settlement. At the beginning of the month, it was under the control of the VSU, and as of today, this settlement is already under the control of the armed forces of the RF. However, nevertheless, Ukrainian servicemen counterattack, attempt to push back Russian forces, but they do not succeed in doing this. We move to the settlement of Novoselivka, Drobichev, and Yarova. As you know, at the beginning of the month, Novoselivka was under the control of the VSU. Also, Drobichev was under the control of the VSU, and naturally, Yarova is now under the control of the VSU. It is precisely from this point that during the month video material arrived. Here, forward positions of Russian forces were located. They looked as follows. The VSU conducted a counterattack, and here several Russian servicemen were destroyed. Several Russian military were taken prisoner, after which the armed forces of the RF conducted a counterattack and expanded the control zone. Thus, they took control of all this territory over the past week. Also, Russian troops repeatedly conducted storm operations in the direction of the settlement of Novoselivka. After unsuccessful storm operations here, Russian troops changed tactics, bypassed Novoselivka from the northwestern outskirts, and now it is under the full control of Russian forces. Those who viewed daily video clips, know about the course of events in this settlement. Here was the most powerful fortified area of the VSU, which Russian troops could not capture for a long time, and now it is under the control of the armed forces of the RF, and pressure is already going on the settlement of Yarova. Repeatedly news arrived that Russian troops are expanding the control zone in the eastern part of the settlement of Yarova and are pressing in the direction of this settlement. However, over recent days changes arrived. Expansion of the control zone is happening precisely to the north and to the northwest of this settlement. Russian troops have definitely already cut the supply road to Yarova, and the transition of Yarova under the control of the armed forces of the RF is a matter of time. Also, Russian troops are moving in the direction of the settlement of Alexandrivka. Here strikes were repeatedly delivered against VSU positions with the help of FPV drones and artillery. Aviation also worked. Over the past few days, here Russian troops significantly expanded the control zone in the direction of this settlement. Over the past month, such changes are on the Krasnolymansk direction. Changes are marked in red. We move to the Kupiansk direction. In the Kupiansk direction, there are insignificant changes. Let's start with the settlement of Borivska Andriivka. As you know, previously Russian troops controlled territory. More precisely, at the beginning of the month, Russian troops controlled all this territory. Borivska Andriivka was under the control of the VSU. However, for the most part, it most likely was in the grey zone, not under the control of the VSU and not under the control of Russian servicemen. Then data arrived that this settlement passed under the full control of Russian forces. Russian troops advanced in the direction of the settlement of Bohuslavka, established themselves on the southern outskirts of this settlement, and now at the current moment the map looks as follows. Literally a few days ago, confirming materials arrived about the expansion of the control zone in favor of the armed forces of the RF, from the direction of Borivska Andriivka in the direction of the settlement of Borova. Over the past month, changes in this section of combat operations are marked for you in red. We move to Kupiansk. In Kupiansk, over the past month, there are changes both in Kupiansk itself and in the area of Stepova Novoselivka and in the area of Pavlivka. From Pavlivka, data arrived literally a couple of days ago. It is precisely from this point that video material arrived confirming the expansion of the control zone south of the settlement of Sinkivka. I remind you that the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation stated that Pavlivka passed under the full control of the armed forces of the RF, and now active combat operations are being conducted in the area of the settlement of Kucherivka, Podoli, Kupiansk, Vuzlovyi, and Kurilivka. At the beginning of the month, the territory looked as follows. The settlement of Pischane was under the control of Russian forces. Also part of Kurilivka was under the control of Russian forces. However, over the past week there was a counterattack from the VSU in the direction of the settlement of Pischane. And some pro-Ukrainian sources claim that Pischane is under the control of the VSU. However, no confirming information, either from the VSU or from the Russian army, came from there about the expansion of the control zone. In the Vovchansk direction, also Russian troops significantly expanded their presence. Vovchansk was practically completely cleared. Territory to the west was definitely cleared. Also, Russian servicemen entered the next settlement of Vovcha. That is all I have on the front. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel and stay in touch.